Not many people think about the history of the mundane things, the things that have been part of human history, well, ever since there was a history. And beer is very much so one of these things. I mean, many people think about beer or come into contact with it, but not many people really think about where it came from, or how it evolved into being the most consumed alcoholic beverage in the world. Now, naturally, when talking about a subject such as beer, a staple of human civilization, far predating the written word, it is impossible to talk about everything in one video. Therefore, this video will focus on just the history and the invention of beer in the early Middle Ages. If you're confused on how beer could be invented in the early Middle Ages, when I have already pointed out that beer production occurred far before then, well, that's because not all beer is created equal. By that I mean the definition of the word beer, even today, is varied. Some beverages that people today may call beer would in the past be called ales or meads, which confusingly are also words that have varied definitions and are sometimes used as synonyms for beer. Let's create a very oversimplified diagram. Ale, mead, and beer are the most common alcoholic brews, as in they need to be brewed, which is a specific process of making alcohol that separates these drinks from other historically alcoholic beverages, most notably wines or ciders. So, mead is an alcoholic beverage that ferments honey, sometimes with various fruits, spices, grains, or hops. Mead mostly isn't brewed, but can be, and when it is, it counts under the brewing category. Ale is an alcoholic beverage brewed with malt, which is a germinated grain, and most often mixed with gruit, which is a mixture of multiple herbs that varied widely depending on the region it was made in. Ale can also sometimes be mixed with other things, not just gruit, which makes its definition even more complicated. Lastly, beer is an alcoholic beverage brewed with malt and mixed with hops, not gruit or any kind of other herb or fruit like ale can be. These definitions, however, aren't complete and today aren't really used. For example, most pale ales, which are called ales, do in fact use hops, not gruit, while other drinks just called ales still only use gruit. But in the end, we classify all pale ales or IPAs or just ales as beers, even though beers should only be drinks that use malt and hops, which a lot of ales don't. They sometimes use other stuff on top of the hops, but as mentioned before, they also use gruit, fruits, or a mixture of various other things. Not to mention, although rare, brewed meads which use honey but also sometimes mixed with fruits, hops, and malt are also called beers. It seems like today the word beer is a catch-all for any kind of alcoholic brew. However, for most of history, the word beer wasn't used this way, and therefore when you look at historical finds labeled as beer, like one of the oldest records of brewing from 7000 BCE China, where malted rice, which is a grain, was found to be mixed with honey and fruits, it is hard to define if this was really beer or if it was mead since it had honey, or was it just a type of ale and not beer since it had no hops. But then again, we call brewed beverages today that don't have hops beers, so why couldn't this be a beer? Anyway, this entire complicated pedantic explanation is to say that historically beer was only used to describe an ale that was mixed with hops, not gruit or fruit or anything else. Even though today we may use the word beer to describe many more beverages than just this, and today's use of hops and beer is a bit different than in the Middle Ages. With that said, technically by its old definition, beer was created in the early Middle Ages when people started brewing ales with hops, and anything before then, like Mesopotamian, Chinese, Egyptian, etc. brewing was technically just ales or brewed mead, not beer. Although I do agree that by modern definitions of the word beer, those drinks could be called beers, but we'll ignore that for the sake of this video. So, who created the first beer? Well, as with any firsts in history of very common things like the wheel or tongs, it is almost impossible to pinpoint a very first instance of brewing beer, as brewing beer was very much a gradual process, with a lot of places like England preferring to brew ales instead of beer all the way until the 16th century. With that said, by the time of the early Middle Ages, humans have been brewing mead and ale for millennia, using mostly gruit but also many other things like fruits or honey to mix with the malted grains like rice in the east and wheat and barley in the west. Egyptians, Chinese, Mesopotamians, Greeks, Romans, Celts, Slavs, Finno-Permic, Scythians, Illyrians, Germanic tribes, etc. all brewed some sorts of ales, although of course some people were more fond of them than others. For example, Romans viewed ale as a peasant or even barbarian drink, with the higher classes drinking solely wine. With almost every people group in Europe and many outside of it making some sort of ale by mixing malt with various things, it wouldn't be far-fetched that at some point someone somewhere happened to brew malt with hops making the first beer. After all, humans like to experiment with making alcoholic beverages, and hops was a known plant in ancient Europe, being used for mostly medicinal purposes but also coloring or rope making. So it wouldn't be that weird to see brewed beer early on, but since most people in ancient Europe didn't know how to write, we can only tell with certainty that Romans and Greeks never actually mixed malt with hops, not other people groups. Although once writing did spread across Europe, there doesn't seem to be any specific area that extensively already used hops for brewing, so it is fair to say that before the 8th to 10th century, any potential brewing with hops would have been very limited, with the practice only growing in popularity during this time. What I find very interesting, however, is that the first ever written mention of hop cultivation comes from Geisenfeld, Bavaria, where in 736 a Western Slavic prisoner is mentioned to be cultivating hops for some reason. Now, this could easily be hops cultivation by a prisoner for medicinal or other purposes, but it is fun to speculate. It is also important to note that cultivation of hops in the 8th century was quite rare. Outside of Geisenfeld, there were only a couple of other mentions of it happening by the 9th century, mostly in France and Switzerland. This was because the way most people got their hops for medicinal purposes was through gathering of wild hops rather than cultivation. But it wouldn't be far-fetched to assume that some cultivation of hops for medicinal and other purposes did spring up. Although with that said, there is also no evidence to suggest that this hops couldn't have been used for brewing as well. In fact, there are some archaeological finds that could support the brewing with hops as early as the 7th century, but more research needs to be done into that. There is also a theory that brewing with hops comes from Eastern Europe, specifically from the Balto-Finnic and Slavic tribes, as their word for hops, himel, chmel, humala, are from the same origin, meaning there must be some explicit reason why the Slavic and Balto-Finnic tribes share the same word for this specific unassuming plant. This is also further supported by the fact that an old Finnish oral myth that could be possibly dated as far back as 3000 years ago mentions brewing ale specifically with hops. However, this tale was only written down in the 19th century when brewing with hops has existed for about 1000 years, so it is very plausible that this tale, which was passed down orally, just changed the brewing section of the tale from gruit to hops in the last 1000 years. With all that said, the first mention of hops directly associated with brewing was written by Adalard of Corbie, most likely in association with the establishment of the new monastery of Corvey in 822. In it, hops was mentioned to be collected along with firewood for the brewing process. The entire writing was meant to be a sort of guide on what jobs monks and monasteries in the Frankish kingdom should be doing. This means that this first mention of hops and brewing in the 9th century only tells us that brewing beer was already an established practice in northern Frankish monasteries. Also, from this mention and various similar ones after it, it becomes clear that hops wasn't really cultivated for brewing during this time. In fact, it was gathered from the wild just like when it was used for only medicinal purposes. It wasn't until the 10th and 11th century that more written records started to mention hops being cultivated instead of just gathered from the surrounding area. This cultivation of hops coincides with the appearance of many more written records of brewing ale with hops over gruit. However, as mentioned before, our first written record of brewing beer suggests it was already an established practice, and this is supported by archaeological records which show evidence of brewing beer in the 8th or possibly as already mentioned 7th century, with the practice becoming more popular by the 9th and 10th century and being quite widespread across the entire HRE and northern France by the 11th century. And yes, despite some early written mentions of beer brewing coming from northern France, early beer seems to have been mostly just a Holy Roman Empire thing, and actually within the HRE it seems to have three main areas of activity: Bavaria, Bohemia, and the Low Countries. These three areas seem to have consistently the most early archaeological records about beer brewing before the 10th century. However, the caveat here is that the Low Countries don't seem to have as many early written records about beer brewing as Bavaria or Bohemia. Also, the main varieties of hops all the way until the 1970s were either from Bohemia or Bavaria, not the Low Countries. On top of that, we see a large pushback against beer brewing instead of ale brewing in the Low Countries around the 13th and 14th century, which doesn't make sense if that area really had beer brewing as early on as Bavaria and Bohemia. What is most likely is that beer brewing probably established itself in Bavaria, which has one of the oldest written records about brewing beer, and Bohemia, which has one of the oldest archaeological records about brewing beer, and from there the technology spread into the Low Countries where it was embraced much more quickly than in the other areas of the HRE, therefore leaving a strong early archaeological mark despite the lack of written records. However, with that said, I do admit more research needs to be done into this area. So looking at Bavaria and Bohemia and trying to figure out which area did in fact start brewing beer the first, in around probably the 8th century, is impossible to tell. I personally like to believe that the Western Slavs have discovered the superiority of beer over ale and then showed it to the Bavarians, which were on the forefront of the Frankish-Slavic interactions. I mean, remember our first written record about cultivation of hops? But this is purely a biased point on my part, and it's just as likely that it was a Bavarian invention picked up by the Western Slavs exactly due to the fact that the Bavarians were on the forefront of the Frankish-Slavic interactions. Nonetheless, the brewing of beer, once it was established in Bohemia and Bavaria, did seem to spread quickly across the Holy Roman Empire, most enthusiastically being embraced, as mentioned before, by the Dutch and then the northern German trading cities. This was mainly because hops preserved beer for much longer. Before hops, ale with Grut had to be consumed quite quickly or it would go bad, meaning brewing and consumption of ale usually happened locally. But now with hops, beer could be traded over long distances as it would survive the voyage. This explains why the trade-oriented Dutch would be so keen on embracing beer so quickly, and thanks to them and the northern German trading cities, by the 14th century beer was pretty much known all around Europe. However, this change from ale to beer didn't come without problems, and there's truly far too many to mention here, but the most notable one that I already alluded to was the reluctance of many local rulers to accept beer. This was mainly because all across medieval Europe there was a well-established tax on gruit, which was used to brew ales before beer was introduced, and this tax was quite a sizable part of the income to the upper class estates and sometimes even the church. But now that people started to use hops, a plant readily available in the wild, this tax income started to disappear. This meant that many rulers, like for example William III of Holland, outright banned the use of hops in brewing in 1321, but he repealed this law just 2 years later, presumably due to public pressure. Similar events of beer versus ale happened all across Europe, most notably in England in the 15th and 16th century. Lastly, no early beer history would be complete without mentioning monasteries. Contrary to popular belief, monasteries actually accounted for little overall beer production and history, as most beer was brewed by independent households themselves or in urban areas in some kind of a city-established brewery. Why we hear and talk so much about monasteries when it comes to brewing is because they're the only ones who actually wrote about it early on, and they also represent a far more stable and continuous production of beer in history, which cannot be said about city breweries, let alone home brewing. This is why all the early written records about beer brewing come from monasteries, and also why these written records can't really be used as dating markers for brewing ale with hops, as these monasteries most likely just picked up the practice of brewing with hops from the local people. However, other than leaving us with written records, monasteries were also very valuable because it was probably through them that the practice of brewing beer spread across the Frankish kingdoms. On a bit of a side note, I'll conclude with a quote which I think is quite apt during these times. It is from an anthropologist, M. Douglas, who wrote about alcohol including beer, saying, "They make and create an intelligible, bearable world, which is much more how an ideal world should be than the painful chaos threatening all the time." Lastly, special thanks to my patrons, they really do help out a lot. As always, my name is Emlaser, and stick around for history.